and then with action that's taken. And that in turn has made it difficult to have a robust policy-making process, as Tom said. Now, he's raised a number of the areas, though, where Congress is trying to restore itself to a position where they are the first branch and where they can be a part of a legitimate process of two branches who are struggling together to try to work through the balance of powers. Let me throw in a couple more. One takes us back to the final stages of the Bush administration, when we had the financial crisis and Treasury Secretary Paulson came to Congress with a plan to do triage with the financial institutions and industries in the country. But the Paulson plan, as he brought it forward, was a very simple plan. You give me all the authority that I need in several lines to go forward. Congress, to its credit, balked at that, but still gave an enormous amount of leeway to the executive branch at a time of intense pressure and crisis, where one could legitimately argue that we were teetering at the abyss of depression and deflation. The real test is not what you do when you're under intense pressure with crisis, where some safeguards were built in, but what you do after, when you have an enormous commitment of power and huge sums of money to be spent, making sure that there is both oversight of how that power is exercised and the dollars are spent, and accountability for what follows. And there, Congress, I think, one could argue, is doing a reasonably good job. And one thing in particular, although we'll see how it goes, especially in the cauldron of dysfunctional partisan and ideological politics, Congress passed a law requiring a commission, which has its first meeting today on Constitution Day, with bipartisan involvement, co-chaired by former California Controller Phil Angelides and a former Republican member of the House, Bill Thomas, to go back and reconstruct all of the things that led up to the financial meltdown, and then see what lessons we could draw and possibly what policies will follow. So some steps have been taken to try and make sure that we don't repeat mistakes, that we can point fingers where government has done things badly, and do its own oversight inside, but also delegate appropriately outside. We'll see if that works. We're having a good and vigorous debate, as Tom suggested, now over the Patriot Act and over elements of the Patriot Act, and whether a reaction against, driven by suspicion of one particular president, follows through with significant congressional responses to make sure, even when there's a different president, that there's a reasonable set of checks and balances built in. And we're having an interesting debate, and of course that extends to other areas of civil liberties. We're having a very interesting debate now about another area where the process has been broken, which is the confirmation process for executive appointees. Much of that debate, a kind of phony one, frankly, over the notion of having a vast expansion of czars in government. For many people, they're defining the term czar very broadly, and they're using the term czar so that they can tie Barack Obama to Russia. Now, this is a group of people too dumb to realize that the czars were the pre-communist Russians, but it doesn't matter, it's Russia. And yet there is a legitimate question here. When you get a significant number of officials with real authority in the executive branch who do not have to go through Senate confirmation or necessarily through hearings, through coming to Congress to testify, and whether you have enough of a link of accountability there. That's a debate we've had before. We had it for a number of years with the director of the office, with the Bureau of the Budget, who was not a Senate confirmable position, until it became transformed into the Office of Management and Budget and was seen no longer as a kind of senior civil service position, but a major policy-making position. It took a while, though, before the head of OMB had to go through Senate confirmation. We had it with the National Security Advisor as well. And in some of these cases, a person in charge of environmental policy or of Homeland Security policy, it's a very legitimate argument to make. In some respects, though, I must say it's overstated, because as we saw with Tom Ridge when he became the first Homeland Security czar in the Bush administration, rather than it being a position of enormous power, because there's no line authority that goes to these people, they don't have control over budgets, oftentimes it's a great title without a great deal of power. But that's a legitimate argument to have. I hope we'll have an argument at the other side as well, where we get an imbalance in the constitutional roles and powers. The Senate now has 1,141 executive branch positions that it has made confirmable. Many of these are not at the level of cabinet, sub-cabinet, agency head, or czar. They are people who become part-time, unpaid members of scholarship or other advisory boards, basically made subject to Senate confirmation so that the Senate has an ample number of potential hostages to take when individual senators decide they want leverage over the executive branch, and pluck out some hapless individual, hold them in limbo until they can get satisfaction elsewhere, which has become, I believe, a real abuse of senatorial authority that has little to do with accountability of executive branch officials. And indeed, because each of those 1,141 has to go through, by executive order, a full FBI security check, has caused an enormous clog in the process and has kept the president from being able to get the people he needs in place. So maybe we can have a legitimate debate about this. Tom mentioned the war in Afghanistan as a good example, and I think that's true up to now. But we are going to see, I believe, some real testing over war powers over the course of the next 6 months or a year. It's going to come in a couple of ways. One way in which Barack Obama, in a very salutary fashion, moved from a dubious, at best, practice of the Bush administration, which was to fund a war through supplemental appropriations, through the back door, by basically trying to pretend that it wasn't costing anything, without subjecting it to the same kinds of pressures, costs and benefit ratios in budgeting that everything else was subjected to. And Obama said no more supplementals. But if we reach a point where President Obama believes, as he articulated regularly as candidate Obama, that Afghanistan is a war of necessity, even as Iraq was, is a war of necessity, even as Iraq was a war of choice, and that it is necessary to at least prevail enough to keep the country from melting down, and that will require an ongoing and sustained and maybe even increased American commitment. If it can't be funded through the normal appropriations process, or if Congress decides it doesn't want to fund something that he believes is absolutely necessary in the national interest, we're going to get the time-worn but regular debates and tension, in this case between Democrats in Congress and a Democratic president. And that is going to be an interesting test ahead, I suspect, as we see almost every major figure in the administration calling for an increase in troop levels, even as many of the president's closest allies are going back to the refrain on Afghanistan that they used with Bush and Iraq, wanting a definitive timetable for withdrawal, the same kind of definitive timetable that candidate Obama called for. Finally, I just want to add an additional note that in many ways flows from the debasement of discourse that the Wilson experience on the House floor suggests, but that we also see in many other ways. And that is the external environment. Congress, the President, the court, Tom's already dealt, I think, adequately with the challenge to the system from a Supreme Court that appears ready to go well beyond boundaries that it's followed in the past, but often can work out their own agreements, disagreements, and arrangements on their own. It's become much more difficult with an external environment, with a cacophony of voices and of outlets, but where increasingly the norm is shrill, angry, populist rhetoric that calls into question the very legitimacy of our institutions and the people who serve in those institutions. And what dismayed me the most about the Wilson affair was that instead of being subject to shame and obloquy, he's become a celebrity superstar. 400 of the 435 members of the House or so will never appear on a Sunday talk show. The vast majority of them would seriously consider giving up their firstborn for an opportunity to appear on one of those Sunday talk shows. They look at their colleagues who get on regularly, Michelle Bachmann, Joe Wilson, and it is not a model that you want. But no matter what those people say, or in fact, the more outrageous the statements, the more they're invited on television, the more they become targets for major speeches, get stopped in airports and told how wonderful they are, and have platforms that are not available to others. They become role models, but they're role models that get iterated out throughout the culture that create a serious challenge to the Constitution itself by challenging the very foundations of the institutions, of the process, and of the people in those institutions. And one final note, when we had originally talked about coming up here around this time, it was to coincide with September 11th. And of course, we are 6 days past the 8th anniversary of that horrific moment which you felt in New York and we felt in Washington, as the rest of the country and the world did subsequently. For 8 years since that point, Tom and I, struck by the reality that we have no plans in place to preserve our constitutional framework in the event of a devastating terror attack on Washington, one that came within an eyelash of basically destroying the House of Representatives and possibly leaving us without a Congress for many, many months. Realizing afterwards, as you examine the Presidential Succession Act of 1947, that it's built around a premise that the threat to the system would come from a nuclear attack that would leave ample time to evacuate Washington, not prepared for a terrorist attack with no notice, and so there's nobody in the line of succession outside of Washington. A Supreme Court which has no plan if it is devastated in some fashion, and if there's the fog of war and it's not clear who has the legitimate power to take over, you'd have 13 appeals courts popping up and saying, we'll make that decision. And over 8 years of trying to suggest that it's time to build in some insurance for the American people so that we don't have to rely on the equivalent of martial law at the worst possible time for many months, we've made precious little headway. And on Constitution Day, it's a particularly good time to reflect on the need to make sure, in this day and age, that we have a Constitution that is ready to continue to function with the constitutional institutions that our framers put in place and that we've come to rely on at the moments of greatest stress. And we hope you'll join us in pushing, prodding members of Congress and others to do their duty, the equivalent of people writing a will who find all kinds of reasons not to do it until it's too late. Thank you.
We would be delighted to hear your comments, to respond to your questions. And we have mics, so please, have at us. Yes?
You mentioned the, is this on? Okay. You mentioned the case Citizens United against whoever.
Yeah.
And if it's determining whether corporations can be involved in the electoral process, how is a corporation different than any other like interest group, like a private union or any other private?
Unions are also included under this prohibition. Actually, both corporations and unions can be active in politics through the voluntary participation of their members to form a political action committee or to engage in any form of communication financed by their treasuries within the organization itself. But the argument beginning really at the end of the 19th century in the face of the abuses of the Gilded Age, led by Elijah Root and Theodore Roosevelt, was that because the state gives particular legal advantages to corporations to engage in profit-making activity, they don't enjoy the same First Amendment rights as individuals. That's basically been the argument, and beginning in 1907, corporations were forbidden to use their treasuries to make contributions to candidates. In 1947, expenditures were explicitly included, that is, going out and running ads on behalf of or against a candidate, even though the framers of the Tilden Act in 1907 believed that their law included that, and labor unions were included as well. This has been reaffirmed in various congressional statutes, and a number of court decisions have effectively affirmed the constitutionality of that. Now, the case came, this particular case, which had to do with a movie about Hillary Clinton, a sort of a bizarre